Good morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and as always told, I had a voice radio. So today, we are celebrating. You see, for the first time in over 2 years, since my Mega Ordino video did very well, we have a new most popular deck on PTCGRadio. And it is the video about the Haymaker deck that I called, and I think I'm pretty safe in saying this with quite a lot of certainty, the original broken Pokemon deck. So in honor of that, and we did look at Blastoise the other day as well, I thought it might be fun to have a look at the original super annoying Pokemon deck. We are talking, of course, about the Damage Swap Alakazam. And yes, it was a bit of a setup deck, and yes, it could be outsped sometimes by these decks like Haymaker. But it was, in and of its own right, a very, very good deck. And it was all built around the Damage Swap Alakazam, which had a Pokemon Power Damage Swap. As often as you like during your turn before you attack, you may move one damage counter from one of your Pokemon to another, as long as you don't knock out this Pokemon. And there was, and this was very, 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 very common back in the day, an appendix there that you could not use this Pokemon power if Alakazam is asleep, confused, or paralyzed. This used to be a very common thing. So the theory very simply was that you would just spread damage around your field and then heal it off. And you would try and wall your opponent as much as you possibly can. So if you were looking for a giant Pokemon back in the day just to soak up a whole bunch of damage, it's Chansey. It's base set Chansey. It's got 120 HP on a basic Pokemon. Now, when you remember that Blastoise had 100 as a stage 2, and Alakazam had 80 as a stage 2, and even we look at the big boy Charizard that was everybody's favourite Pokemon back in the day, as this big bad stage 2 that only had 120... 120 on a basic is ridiculous. You did have a weakness to Hitmonchan, which was a bit of a problem, but otherwise, that was a lot of damage. And then, of course, you could sit there using a scrunch attack, flip a coin, if heads, you prevent any damage done next turn. So you can actually try and make it on average that your opponent only gets to attack Chansey every other turn, and then you've got a ridiculous amount of HP. I mean, even though you're weak to Hitmonchan, a special punch would only do 80 damage with weakness, and plus power goes on after weakness, so you'd need a special punch and all 4 plus power to get a one-hit KO. Quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, that just wasn't happening. And then once you had a whole bunch of damage on Chansey, you could then heal it off. Now, Mr. Fuji was a good one to use. Choose a Pokemon on your bench, shuffle it and any cards attached to it into your deck. Or, of course, you could just use Scoop Up. Scoop Up was good because it just let you pick up one of your basic Pokemon, though you did lose any energy attached to it, which is why Mr. Fuji was better, though you would have to get Chansey on the bench. Chansey could sit in the active as a damage sponge, or you could just move any damage from your active onto Chansey while it was on the bench using Alakazam, and then Mr. Fuji it while it was on the bench. And there were some truly impressive walls that we had at the time, possibly the best of which was Mr. Mime. Now, Mr. Mime could basically prevent any KO ever. You see, Mr. Mime had a great Pokemon power, which basically said, this was, I should mention, the Mr. Mime from Jungle, whenever an attack does 30 or more damage to Mr. Mime, prevent that damage, as long as you're not asleep, confused, or paralyzed. Now, you only had 40 HP, but your opponent could only do 20 damage at a time. They couldn't KO, unless they were using something like poison. So what would happen here is they do 20 damage or less, thinking, oh, well, I'll do 20 damage this turn, 20 damage the next, and then you just use Alakazam to move the damage off of Mr. Mime onto a bench Chansey. And then after a few turns, Mr. Fuji picks Chansey up, and we are rolling round again. And that really was the basis of the deck. Now, Kadabra was actually also weirdly good here, because it was just a pretty good attacker. Now, you did have Recover, 2 Psychic Energy, discard 1 to completely heal, so you could, for instance, put damage onto Kadabra and then use Recover, but you've only got 60 HP, it's not as good as Chansey. And then free energy, 50 damage, look, it's not good by modern standards, by any stretch of the imagination. But back in the day, it was pretty gosh darn good. And let's not, of course, forget that Hitmonchan was one of the very, very best attackers in the format, and that had a weakness to Psychic, so you would be getting a very easy KO there. Even Abra really earned its stripes here. Yes, it had 30 HP, but 1 Psychic Energy, 10 damage. Remember, you're hitting weakness on Hitmonchan here. Flip a coin if heads paralysis. And this is a setup deck, right? You need a couple of turns to get your Alakazam out, etc, etc. So here it was quite important to stall for a couple of turns, and Abra would absolutely, get it, let you do this. It's very rare to have a stage 2 chain where each part of the chain is this gosh darn good, but Alakazam really managed to pull it off. Now, if we do pause for a second to look at the attacking options, they're not amazing. Alakazam itself, 30 damage for free energy plus confusion, wasn't good even back then. Kadabra was a much better attacker, and Chansey did have double edge. And the damage done to you shouldn't be a huge problem unless your opponent can immediately capitalize, because your whole deck is designed to take damage off of damaged Pokemon and then heal it. One of the biggest issues was you were slow. In terms of attaching energy, you'll notice there aren't really many good single energy attacks here other than Abra, but the whole point is you're trying to not get KO'd so you can then heal. Abra's got 30 HP, and if your opponent's coming in with a whole bunch of energy removal and super energy removal, and you had better believe that a lot of decks were, you could basically end up in a situation where you just didn't attack, like, ever. And that is a huge problem. It's not the end of the world in some matchups, because you could just deck out your opponent. Your opponent loses if they're unable to draw a card at the beginning of their turn, so you just keep moving damage and healing forever, and then your opponent runs out of cards and loses. Against decks playing a lot of energy denial, this was your only real option. But if they weren't playing enough energy denial here, you could move into a slightly attacking strategy. Certainly against slower decks like Blastoise that were generally not able to find the room for many energy removal cards because they were stage 2, it wasn't really such a huge problem. But while we're here, we do need to mention one thing that was a huge problem for this deck: Muck. Muck came around in the Fossil expansion, and ignore all Pokemon powers other than toxic gases, which is the one on Muck, as long as Muck isn't asleep, confused, or paralyzed. Muck just completely shuts your deck down. Shuts off Alakazam, shuts off Mr. Mime, and the one we're about to talk about in a second. Muck was a huge problem, but Muck didn't see a huge amount of play. But it was a case of, if someone like a Haymaker deck was really worried, they could just get a Muck, chuck it on the bench, and then feel pretty confident that they could take you down here. It was a really good counter to Alakazam. The other issue was, being a stage 2 deck, you could be potentially a tiny bit slow, but we did have Pokemon Trader back in the day, which essentially was just rare candy, but, you know, back then, essentially Pokemon Trader allowed you to just take a basic Pokemon and immediately evolve it into a stage 2. So it basically turned it into a 2-turn getting a stage 2 out rather than a 3-turn, gave you that little bit of extra speed you needed. Plus, of course, and I talked about this in my previous 2 videos, which I will link in the description, so I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail here, but you had Professor Oak, which let you discard your hand and draw 7 new cards. You had Computer Search, which let you discard 2 cards from your hand and then search your deck for any card. So you did have a lot of really good cards for consistency here. You were just never going to be as consistent as something like Haymaker. Now, that was the essence of the deck, but some people did choose to play it with Gengar. Now here you're playing 2 stage 2s, we've got all these item cards we've said about, these trainer cards, but it is still 2 stage 2s. But Gengar was really, really good because it also had a really, really nice, useful ability. Now, weirdly enough, we actually had Ghastly and Haunter in the base set and in Fossil, but we had to wait till Fossil to get a Gengar, but it was a good one. The attack, But the Pokemon Power Curse. Once during your turn, you may move one damage counter from one of your opponent's Pokemon to another. This was really, really nice. You could use it to spread damage around. You could use it to take KOs. I mean, if your opponent had a Pokemon that was 10 damage away from being KO'd, Gengar could just move a damage counter over and KO it. It was really, really fun. But if you use the Fossil, Ghastly and Haunter here, you actually had a couple of really good options as well. And just to be clear, they were definitely the ones you'd want to use. And no, I don't think there's much question. And no, it's not even remotely close. The Fossil Ghastly, 50 HP, pretty good for a basic back then. And then really here, you've either got Lick, 1 Psychic Energy, 10 damage, flip a coin, if heads, paralysis. Basically, it's an Abra, but with 20 more HP. It's also got no weakness and a resistance to fighting, which with Hitmonchan running around is amazing. This could legitimately stand up to a Hitmonchan pretty gosh darn nicely. And then we talked about the whole energy removal strategy. Well, it had an attack for 2 Psychic Energy, which let you grab 2 energy cards from your discard pile into your hand, as long as you're willing to do 10 damage. And because it said energy cards, not basic energy cards, you could actually get a double colorless energy back here if you felt so inclined. Then we have a quick look at the Haunter here, and it's got an amazing Pokemon power. Again, Muck becomes more of an issue. Whenever an attack does anything to Haunter, flip a coin. If heads, prevent all effects of that attack. Now, weirdly, you gain no extra HP. Going from Ghastly to Haunter, you stay at 50. But it means your opponent, on average, will only be attacking every other turn. You're a stalling deck. Yes, you've got attackers. Yes, you've got attacking options. But generally speaking here, stalling is one of the strengths of the deck. This does it beautifully. And then you combine it with your Nightmare attack, which puts the opponent to sleep. And they've got to wake up, 50% chance, then hit a heads on Transparency. If you've got a Haunter in the act of using Nightmare, your opponent has a 25% chance of actually attacking. And then if they don't one-hit KO you, you just move the damage off with Alakazam and heal it when convenient. Oh yeah, and you've got no weakness and a resistance to fighting. It's crazy good. I should mention Gengar also has no weakness and a resistance to fighting. This is pretty much the most annoying deck you could make back in the day. Oh my goodness, it was fun. And I hope I've explained it well. The list on the board does come from Bulbapedia here. It is a list if you're playing Gengar. If you're not playing Gengar, then you just go extra consistency and then a couple extra Mr. Mime. Maybe a couple extra disruption cards as well. So now, ladies and gentlemen, it's over to you. Did you play this deck back in the day? If so, tell me about your build, give a list if you so wish, or just tell me what you think. Go nuts, ladies and gentlemen, but do remember the rules. Be nice. Make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at The Wassy, and Twitch for some live action at twitch.tv/PTCGRadio. If you want to support the channel, get some bonus podcasts and all of that, head on over to patreon.com/PTCGRadio, where you can do exactly that. But by far the most important thing, as always, is to look after yourselves. Until next time. Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.